Hi everyone, Ashley here and welcome to another video on my YouTube channel. Today I'm sharing how I made this cute fall themed or Thanksgiving themed Slimline card using a lot of cute Lawn Fawn critters as well as some ink blending and stenciling for the background. So without further ado, let's get into the card making. I'm starting with the background and I'm using a few different colors of Distress Oxide ink for this. I cut out a panel of just Strathmore Bristol Smooth blending cardstock, and I used a Slimline stitched rectangle die for that, so it's the full size of a Slimline card, which is 3.5 by 8.5 inches. So onto this panel, I blended some yellow ink towards the center. I believe that was scattered straw, and I did it in sort of a circular pattern because I wanted it to be sort of like a spotlight on the critters that are going to be in the middle of this card. So once I had blended that yellow spotlight, I then came in with blue. I believe this is Speckled Egg, but check down in the description below the video for the exact colors and supplies that I used on this card. And I'm just blending all the way around that spotlight with a blending brush. So I'm not really caring to do much of a gradient here because I know I'm going to stencil over it. So I'm really just filling in all of that space with the blue and then of course that center with yellow. And I'm going back and forth a little bit to kind of blend between them, but not too much because I didn't want to create a green color. So I really wanted the colors to just sort of fade into each other without becoming green, so I gently blended between the two. Next, I used that same stitched rectangle die and I used a Grassy border die to cut out this grassy edge along it. And now I'm using two different colors of Distress Oxide ink and blending on. I used Rustic Wilderness as the green and Brush Corduroy as the brown. These are Distress Oxide inks, and I'm just using my blending brush to blend on both with the brown at the bottom and the green towards the top, and again just kind of going back and forth and blending between the two colors. I'm just using a little piece of scrap paper to hold on to that piece so that I'm not getting my fingerprints into the ink. So once those pieces are blended, I'm coming back to the original sky piece and using a leaf stencil to stencil over with the same colors. So again, I'm taking scattered straw and just blending through where that spotlight is, and then I'm taking Speckled Egg and blending through around it. And you'll see that because of the size of the stencil, it's not long enough to cover the full Slimline panel. So I'm just kind of taking the stencil and going back over the spots that I missed. This will, of course, cause a bit of a sort of line where the pattern ends, but I'm going to cover that up with these stamped trees that I had stamped out, so it won't matter, you won't see those lines. So this is what the final pattern looks like. It's very tone on tone because I used the same colors that I had initially blended with to blend in through the stencil. So you get this really subtle tone on tone pattern, which I think is really pretty, and it kind of looks like leaves falling in the background, sort of in the distance maybe. Okay, so you kind of got a sneak peek of the images that I'm using when I tried out that tree onto the card, but here I am stamping them all out. So I used a whole bunch of Lawn Fawn stamp sets for this card, mainly this adorable one with these critters eating a Thanksgiving feast around a stump, but I also pulled from a few other stamp sets for more images. So again, check down in that video description below to see a list of exactly all the supplies that I used and all the names of the stamp sets. I stamped out a whole bunch of images in black Copic friendly ink, and now I'm stamping out this stump in brown ink. I'm using Distress Oxide ink to stamp this out in brown. Honestly, that was because that was the best brown color that I had. I didn't have any other ink pads that were the right brown color that I wanted. I normally wouldn't stamp in Distress Oxide. I normally just reserve that type of ink for blending. It's really good blending ink. Not the best stamping ink from what I've experienced. It doesn't stamp perfectly, but because I was using my mini Misty and I was able to kind of stamp again, it turned out okay. So if you're able to stamp it multiple times and you can kind of just stamp over any spots that might not have stamped perfectly the first time, it turns out just fine, and I liked the way it looked, especially because that stump is meant to be rustic anyway. So if there were any spots that didn't stamp perfectly, it was totally fine. Okay, so moving on to the coloring, I'm just going to show how I colored a few of these images, and I'm starting with the pumpkins. So for these, I used 3 different shades of orange, starting with the darkest at the top, and moving in towards the middle with the middle shade and the lightest shade, and just using sort of wispy motions to create that look of sort of striations on the pumpkin, I guess. And I did come in with sort of a darker orangey brown to really add some dimension at the top and bottom to those pumpkins. Next, I'm coloring in these critters, and I'm starting with the hedgehog using some light brown shades. Starting with the darkest shade sort of towards the interior of the hedgehog and then working my way out to the lighter shades off towards the edges, and then coloring the hedgehog's body with some even lighter shades of brown. I believe that this is E51 and E50 that I'm using here. Once I'm done with the hedgehog, I will move on to the raccoon using some cool gray shades. Before I do that, I am just filling in, of course, the little cheek and ear with some pink. Okay, so for the raccoon, I'm coloring in the raccoon's face with some dark gray as well as the body, and just going through the areas where there should be shadow and adding the darkest shade there, then blending it out with a slightly lighter shade going in towards the middle, and then the lightest shade from there. So I like to do it this way because I like to sort of place down my dark shade where I know it's going to be darkest and then blend it out. And then at the end, if I feel like I need to add extra dimension, like I blended it out too much, I just come back in with the darkest shade and add a little bit more dimension at the end. For the rest of the raccoon's body parts, I am just coloring them in with lighter gray shades, just to add a little bit of difference in dimension so that the whole raccoon isn't dark. There's just parts of the raccoon that are darker and parts that are lighter, which I thought was really nice. Again, just kind of focusing even in these light sections, the slightly darker shade in the areas where there should be shadow, and then blending it out with the lighter shade in every case. For the tail, of course, I'm going back and forth between the light and the dark, which I think is really cute, gives it a little stripy tail. Next is the squirrel, and I'm just coloring the squirrel in with my favorite brown color combination to color squirrels. If you watch many of my other videos, you will have seen that I use the same color combination on pretty much every squirrel that I've colored. I start with E15 as the darkest shade, then E13 as the middle shade, and E00 as the lighter shade, and I just really love this sort of brown color that it gives these squirrels. And again, I'm just starting with the darker shade in areas where there should be shadow and really just blending it out from there, and coming back in with the darkest shade to give it a little bit of extra touch of dimension. Okay, so the main images are now colored. I'm just going to show you how I colored a couple more, starting with this pie, which I wanted it to be pumpkin pie because of course there's pumpkins. So I'm using a light brown shade for the crust and then orange for that interior of the pie. And then I'm just going to use a light warm gray marker to give a little bit of an accent to that, I guess, whipped cream on the top, because really it should be white. So I just wanted the shadow to be slightly gray just to show something a little bit more interesting than plain white. Okay, and the last thing that I'll show the coloring of here is these hats. I'm using some warm grays and just starting from one side with the darkest one and blending it out with medium and light. And then I'll use some cool grays to come in and color those little buckles. I will color the rest of these images off camera and cut them all out so they're all ready to adhere to this card. Okay, so now coming back, I have my panel, which is the ink is nice and dried, and I can glue it down onto a Slimline card base just using some liquid glue and just sticking it down. Then I can take my Grassy piece and do the same thing right on top. And I am making sure to leave a little bit of space along the top where the grass is, so that there's space to tuck little images behind if I need to. And I'm going to tuck some of these trees behind. So if you're doing this and you're building a scene, it is kind of a good trick to use to not necessarily glue your layers down fully if you do plan to tuck things behind. You can just leave them up and then you have space for tucking. Okay, so I'm taking my stump and a little raccoon and just gluing them together and gluing them both down onto the card front here. I knew that I wanted sort of a combination of images being glued down onto the card panel and elevated up on foam squares. So what I'm doing to start is just sort of placing all of these images onto the card where I think I'm going to want them to be. So I'm taking all of those little accessory images and sort of just playing around. I put a few of the pumpkins in front of the stump, one off to the side, a couple of the mushrooms out, and then just sort of figuring out where I want these trees to be. And of course, I put the birch trees off to the side, so they sort of frame the whole scene. And I just think that these little critters eating their dinner is just so cute. By the way, my cat Luna does like to make an appearance in my videos, so you might see her walking about. She's that big ball of gray fur that she likes to join me in my craft room. Okay, so again, just kind of continuing through here, just picking out where the images should go, and once I'm happy with the placement, I'm just picking them up one at a time with my tweezers, adding some liquid glue to them, and then sticking them straight down onto the panel. And like I mentioned, in some cases I am adding foam just to elevate, so I'm choosing to elevate these critters, and I elevate a few of the pumpkins and mushrooms, and really just things that I feel like maybe should be more in the forefront. Plus, I like the combination of adding foam and glue. I just feel like having some images elevated just really adds a nice detail. Now once all of these main images are glued down, I'm just taking just my scissors and cutting off the edges of those trees that were overhanging so that they fit onto the panel. And finally, I can add all of those little pieces of food, part of the dinner, onto the stump. So I did color and cut these off camera, but you can see there's a couple little plates of food. There's a bowl of either baguettes or potatoes, it's hard to tell, and then it looks like a bowl of maybe mashed potatoes. You've got a gravy boat, and then there was a few apples that I had stamped and colored, so I'm just adding those sort of around the scene as well, with one on the table and a couple on the ground. And you might have noticed I did stamp some bugs. These come from a different Lawn Fawn stamp set. Again, check that video description below for the names of all the stamp sets, but I just thought that they were a really cute little addition to the scene. Okay, so to finish off this card, I'm just stamping out the sentiment. So I have Happy Thanksgiving on an acrylic block, and I'm just stamping it in black Versamark ink right at the top to fill in that space. So that is it. That is the final card for today. I hope that you enjoyed watching this video and maybe got some ideas of how to add some nice texture to your backgrounds with some tone-on-tone stenciling. I think that this stamp set is adorable and it's perfect for fall and for Thanksgiving, which by the way, in Canada where I'm located is in October, so I'm not too early. So thank you so much for watching this video. If you want to see more of my cards, make sure to check out my Instagram account, which is linked down in that description box below the video. I post even more cards over there. I hope that you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!